Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're diving deep into the Northern Renaissance, a period of incredible cultural and intellectual rebirth that swept across Europe. While we often think of Italian masters like Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo, the Renaissance wasn't just happening in Italy. North of the Alps, a different kind of revolution was taking place. One focused on words, texts, and reforming society from within. And at the very heart of this movement was a man named Erasmus. So, who was this guy, Erasmus? And now, before your mind drifts deeper into this peaceful journey, take just a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Because every night, with true stories from the Renaissance, you'll fall asleep calmer, deeper, and more at peace. Born in Rotterdam in the late 1460s, he was a Dutch humanist, scholar, and theologian. But calling him just a scholar is like calling Shakespeare just a playwright. Erasmus was a superstar of his time, an intellectual giant whose ideas spread like wildfire across the continent, thanks in large part to a brand new invention, the printing press. He was one of the first truly international best-selling authors. Unlike his Italian counterparts, who were often obsessed with classical Roman and Greek art and architecture, Erasmus and his fellow northern humanists had a different focus. They were Christian humanists. This means they believed that the best way to improve society and the church was to go back to the original sources, the Bible, and the writings of the early church fathers. They wanted to combine the wisdom of classical antiquity with the core tenets of Christianity to create a more enlightened, ethical, and pious society. Erasmus was a master of languages, particularly Latin and Greek. This might sound a bit academic, but it was revolutionary. At the time, the official Bible of the Western Church was the Vulgate, a Latin translation done by Saint Jerome way back in the 4th century. Over 1,000 years, countless errors, typos, and mistranslations had crept into the text through manual copying. Erasmus believed these inaccuracies were obscuring the true message of Jesus and the apostles. He felt that to truly understand Christianity, you had to read the scriptures in their original Greek. So, in 1516, he did something monumental. He published a new edition of the New Testament, laying out the original Greek text side by side, with his own more accurate and elegant Latin translation. He called it De Novam Instrumentum Omni. This was a bombshell. For the first time, scholars across Europe could compare the standard Vulgate with the Greek original, and Erasmus's updated Latin exposed many of the translation errors that had become accepted doctrine and opened the door for a more critical textual analysis of the Bible. It was this very work that Martin Luther would later use to translate the New Testament into German, directly fueling the Protestant Reformation. But Erasmus wasn't just a dry academic. He was also a brilliant. His most famous work, In Praise of Folly, published in 1511, is a razor-sharp and hilarious critique of the society he lived in. In the book, the goddess Folly takes the stage and delivers a speech, arguing that she's the one who really makes the world go round through Folly's voice. Erasmus mercilessly mocks everyone from greedy merchants and clueless philosophers to pompous nobles and most daringly corrupt and ignorant churchmen. He criticizes monks who cared more about their rituals than their charity, popes who acted more like warlords than spiritual leaders, and theologians who argued over trivialities while ignoring the simple message of the gospel. In Praise of Folly was an instant hit. It was witty, accessible, and it perfectly captured the growing dissatisfaction with the state of the church. It made people laugh, but it also made them think. Another one of his key ideas was what he called the Philosophia Christi, or the philosophy of Christ, for Erasmus. Christianity wasn't about complex doctrines, elaborate rituals, or blind obedience to authority. It was about living a simple, ethical life in imitation of Jesus. He believed that the core of faith was an internal, personal relationship with God, characterized by piety, charity, and humility. This was a radical idea. He was essentially telling people to focus less on the external trappings of religion, like pilgrimages, venerating relics, or buying indulgences, and more on developing their inner spiritual life. He wanted to reform the church from within, to purify it and bring it back to its simpler apostolic roots. Through his extensive network of letters, Erasmus corresponded with all the major thinkers of his day, from kings and popes to fellow humanists like Thomas More in England. He was a central node in a vast intellectual network that spread humanist ideas across Northern Europe. His educational writings, like On the Education of a Christian Prince, argued that rulers had a moral duty to be wise, just, and peace-loving. A stark contrast to Machiavelli's more pragmatic, and some would say cynical, advice. Erasmus was a passionate advocate for peace, writing extensively against the constant wars that ravaged Europe, which he saw as fundamentally un-Christian. Now, here's where it gets complicated. When the Protestant Reformation exploded in 1517, many people expected Erasmus to join Martin Luther. After all, they shared many of the same criticisms of the Church. Luther himself deeply admired Erasmus and had used his Greek New Testament, but Erasmus never made the break. He was a reformer, not a revolutionary. He feared that a complete split would shatter the unity of Christendom and lead to chaos and violence. And he was right. He famously engaged in a debate with Luther over the concept of free will, with Erasmus defending the humanist belief that humans have a role in their own salvation, against Luther's insistence on salvation by faith alone. In the end, Erasmus found himself caught in the middle, criticized by Catholics for laying the egg that Luther hatched, and by Protestants for not having the courage to join their cause. Despite being caught in this crossfire, Erasmus's legacy is undeniable. He was the quintessential northern humanist. He championed a return to original sources, used his intellect and wit to critique society, and advocated for a more personal, ethical, and inward-focused form of Christianity. His work on the Greek New Testament laid the philological groundwork for the Reformation, even if he didn't support the schism it created. His satirical writings fostered a climate of critical thinking and questioning of authority, and his promotion of the Philosophia Christi helped shift a significant portion of European religious thought toward a more personal and introspective piety. So while the Italian Renaissance was giving us the statue of David and the Sistine Chapel, sealing the Northern Renaissance with as its leading light, was undertaking a different kind of project, the reform of text, thought, and soul. He was the prince of the humanists, a man whose belief in the power of education, reason, and a purified faith helped shape the intellectual and religious landscape of modern Europe. His influence was profound, proving that the pen, especially when paired with a printing press, can indeed be mightier than the sword. We're journeying back in time to one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Renaissance. Spanning from the 14th to the 17th century, this era was a dazzling explosion of art, culture, and new ideas. But beneath the stunning frescoes of Michelangelo and the brilliant prose of Shakespeare, a quiet but profound struggle was taking place. struggle between long-held religious faith and a new, daring way of understanding the world. Science. For centuries, the Church had been the ultimate authority on pretty much everything. It explained the heavens, the earth, and our place within them. The universe was seen as a divine creation, with Earth at its center, all orchestrated by God's hand. This geocentric model, championed by the ancient astronomer Ptolemy and adopted by the Church, wasn't just a scientific theory. It was a cornerstone of faith. It affirmed humanity's special place in creation. But as the Renaissance dawned, a new spirit of inquiry began to stir. Scholars started dusting off ancient Greek and Roman texts, not just to revere them, but to question them. This movement, known as humanism, placed a new emphasis on human potential and reason. It encouraged people to observe the world for themselves, to use their own eyes and intellect to uncover truth. This shift set the stage for what we now call the scientific revolution. It wasn't an overnight event, but a gradual process of discovery that began to chip away at the established worldview. Let's start with the cosmos. In 1543, a Polish astronomer named Nicolaus Copernicus published a book that would change everything. It was called On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres. In it, Copernicus proposed a radical idea. What if the sun, not the earth, was the center of the universe? This heliocentric model was mind-blowing. It wasn't just a reshuffling of planets. It demoted Earth from its privileged central position. Copernicus, being a cautious man and a member of the clergy himself, knew how controversial this would be. He actually waited until he was on his deathbed to publish his work. Initially, his ideas didn't cause a huge stir, partly because they were so complex and written in Latin, accessible only to a small circle of scholars. The Church didn't immediately condemn it. Some even saw it as a useful mathematical tool for calculating the dates of religious festivals. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Then came Johannes Kepler, a German astronomer who took Copernicus's ideas a step further. Using incredibly precise observational data, Kepler figured out that planets don't move in perfect circles, as everyone had believed for millennia. Instead, they travel in ellipses or ovals. This might sound like a small detail, but it was huge. The idea of perfect celestial circles was tied to the idea of a perfect divine heaven. Kepler's discovery suggested that the heavens were governed by mathematical laws that were predictable, consistent, and maybe not so mysterious after all. The real firestorm, however, was ignited by an Italian astronomer named Galileo. Unlike Copernicus, Galileo was not a quiet scholar. He was a brilliant, passionate, and often confrontational figure who was determined to prove the heliocentric theory, and he had a powerful new tool to do it: the telescope. When Galileo pointed his telescope to the heavens, he saw things no one had ever seen before. He saw mountains and craters on the moon, proving it wasn't a perfect, smooth orb. He discovered 4 moons orbiting Jupiter, which showed that not everything in the universe revolved around the Earth. He observed the phases of Venus, which could only be explained if Venus orbited the Sun. Galileo published his findings not in scholarly Latin, but in everyday Italian, so everyone could read them. This made his ideas incredibly popular and incredibly dangerous for the Church. This was a direct challenge. If Galileo was right, then the Bible, as it had been interpreted for centuries, was wrong on a fundamental point of astronomy. This wasn't just about planets. It was about the very authority of the Scripture and the Church itself. In 1616, the Church officially condemned the Copernican theory as foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical. Galileo was warned to stop teaching it. But Galileo, convinced he was right, couldn't stay silent. In 1632, he published his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, a book that cleverly argued for the Copernican model. The response was swift and severe. Galileo was put on trial by the Inquisition, found vehemently suspect of heresy, and forced to publicly recant his views. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The story of Galileo became the classic symbol of the conflict between science and faith. Brilliant mind, silenced by dogma. But the story is more complex than that. It wasn't always a simple case of science good, religion bad. Many of the early scientists, including Copernicus, Kepler, and even Galileo himself, were devoutly religious men. They didn't see their work as an attack on faith. On the contrary, they believed that by studying the natural world, they were uncovering the genius of God's creation. Kepler famously said he was merely thinking God's thoughts after him. They saw science as a form of worship, a way to appreciate the intricate beauty and order of the universe that God had made. The conflict was often less about science versus God, and more about new knowledge versus established institutional authority. The church was a powerful political and social institution, and it was resistant to anything that threatened its control over knowledge and truth. The same tension was playing out in other fields as well. Take medicine and anatomy. For centuries, medical knowledge was based on the ancient Greek physician Galen. The church forbade the dissection of human bodies, which severely limited any real understanding of anatomy. But during the Renaissance, artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, driven by a desire to portray the human form more realistically, began conducting secret dissections. Leonardo's anatomical drawings are breathtakingly accurate, revealing a deep understanding of the human body's inner workings. This work was formally advanced by Andreas Vesalius, a Flemish physician who is often called the father of modern anatomy. In 1543, the same year Copernicus published his book, Vesalius published on the fabric of the human body. Based on his own Vesalius corrected hundreds of errors in Galen's work, which had been based on animal dissections. His work revolutionized medicine, showing that true knowledge had to be based on direct observation, not blind acceptance of ancient authority. Again, this was seen by some as a challenge to tradition, but for Vesalius and others, it was about revealing the miraculous complexity of the human body and other of God's creations. So was the Renaissance a time of war between science and faith. It's more accurate to say it was a period of intense negotiation. The boundaries between science, philosophy, and theology were not as clear as they are today. People were trying to reconcile new discoveries with their faith. Thinkers like Francis Bacon, an English philosopher, argued for a new method of inquiry based on evidence and experimentation, the scientific method. But he also wrote extensively on theology. He proposed that there were two books to read: the book of Scripture, which reveals God's will, and the book of nature, which reveals God's works. In his view, science and religion were complementary paths to truth, not competing ones. This period laid the groundwork for the modern world. The courage of thinkers like Copernicus, Galileo, and Vesalius to question authority and trust their own observations sparked a revolution that is still unfolding today. They showed that the universe was governed by natural laws that could be discovered and understood through reason and experiment. While this led to undeniable conflict with religious institutions, it wasn't a simple rejection of faith. For many, it was a reimagining of it. They believed in a God who had created a rational, orderly universe, and they felt it was their duty and They're privileged to explore and understand it. The legacy of this era is profound. It taught us the value of skepticism, the importance of evidence, and the courage to challenge established ideas. It was a messy, complicated, and sometimes dangerous process, but it ultimately expanded our understanding of the universe and our place in it in ways that were previously unimaginable. The debate about the relationship between science and faith continues to this day, but it was during the Renaissance that the questions were first posed with such urgency and consequence. Now, journeying back in time to one of the most electrifying periods in human history, the Renaissance. When we think of the Renaissance, what comes to mind? Masterpieces by Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, the magnificent domes of Florence, the groundbreaking discoveries of Copernicus. It was an age of rebirth, a cultural explosion that reshaped art, science, and how people saw themselves and the world. But what fueled this incredible transformation? What were the big ideas buzzing in the minds of the era's greatest thinkers? While many factors were at play, two ancient philosophies rediscovered and replayed a starring role: Neostoicism and Neoplatonism. These weren't just dusty old ideas. They were the intellectual engines of the Renaissance, influencing everything from political theory to the brushstrokes of a painting. Let's unravel the philosophical threads that wove the brilliant tapestry of the Renaissance. First, let's talk about Neo. To understand it, we have to go back even further to ancient Greece and the philosopher Plato. Plato famously argued that the physical world we perceive with our senses is not the real world. It's merely a shadow, an imperfect copy of a higher, more perfect, an eternal realm of forms or ideas. The ultimate form is the form of the good, which he associated with truth, beauty, and justice. Now, fast forward a few centuries to the 3rd century AD. A philosopher named Plotinus took Plato's ideas and developed them into a more mystical and spiritual system, which we now call Neoplatonism. Plotinus envisioned a single, transcendent source of all existence, which he called the One. From the One, everything else emanates or flows outwards in a series of levels, a bit like light radiating from the sun. The further you get from the One, the less perfect and more material things become. The human soul, according to Plotinus, originates in this higher realm and yearns to return to its divine source. So, how did this ancient mystical philosophy make a comeback in Renaissance Italy? The key moment was the fall of Constantinople in 1453. As the Byzantine Empire crumbled, many Greek scholars fled to Italy, bringing with them a treasure trove of ancient texts, including the complete works of Plato and Plotinus, which had been largely lost to Western Europe for centuries. In Florence, the powerful Medici family, great patrons of the arts and learning, established the Platonic Academy, led by the brilliant scholar Marsilio Ficino. Ficino dedicated his life to translating these ancient works into Latin, making them accessible to a wider audience. But he did more than just translate. He synthesized Neoplatonism with Christianity, arguing that Plato's philosophy was a divine precursor to Christian truth. He saw the Neoplatonic quest to ascend back to the One as parallel to the Christian soul's journey to reunite with God. This blend of classical philosophy and Christian theology was incredibly appealing to the Renaissance mindset. This new wave of Neoplatonism had a profound impact on art. Suddenly, artists weren't just seen as craftsmen copying nature. They were seen as creators, divinely inspired individuals who could reveal the higher spiritual beauty that lay hidden within the material world. Taki Botticelli, Rembrandt's famous painting, The Birth of Venus. This isn't just a picture of a mythological goddess emerging from the sea. For the Renaissance viewers steeped in Neoplatonism, it was a profound allegory. Venus represents divine beauty and love, born not from earthly origins, but from a higher, purer source. The painting is a celebration of the idea that contemplating physical beauty can elevate the soul and lead it towards the divine. Similarly, when you look at Michelangelo's sculptures, like the David, you see more than just a perfect human form. You see an idealized version of humanity, a reflection of the divine form of man. The artist's genius was in his ability to perceive this divine idea and bring it to life in stone. Neoplatonism gave artists a new, elevated purpose: to make the invisible visible. It infused art with a deep intellectual and spiritual dimension that went far beyond simple representation. Now, let's switch gears to the other major philosophical revival of the time. Like Neoplatonism, this was a Renaissance adaptation of an ancient school of thought, Stoicism, which originated in Greece and became very popular in the Roman Empire with thinkers like Seneca, Epictetus, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The core idea of Stoicism is living in accordance with nature, which they understood as a rationale, ordered universe governed by divine reason, or logos. The Stoics believe that we can't control external events. What happens, happens, but we can control our response to them. The key to a good life, a life of virtue and tranquility, is to accept what we cannot change and to focus on what we can: our own thoughts, judgments, and actions. It's a philosophy of inner strength, resilience, and self-control. It teaches that virtue is the only true good and that things like health, wealth, and reputation are indifferents. They are nice to have, but they don't determine our happiness or moral worth. So why did this philosophy resonate so strongly during the Renaissance? Well, the 14th to 17th centuries were a time of immense turmoil. Europe was racked by religious wars, political instability, plagues, and social upheaval. In this chaotic environment, Stoicism offered a powerful psychological anchor. It provided a moral compass and a framework for maintaining personal integrity and peace of mind amidst the storm. The key figure in the revival of Stoicism was the Flemish humanist Justus Lipsius. Living through the brutal conflicts of the Dutch Revolt, Lipsius sought a philosophy that could provide solace and ethical guidance. He found it in the writings of Seneca and Tacitus. In his hugely influential book, De Constantia or Constantia, published in 1584, Lipsius blended Stoic principles with Christian beliefs. He argued that a Christian could embrace the Stoic ideals of self-discipline, reason, and emotional fortitude without abandoning their faith. He softened some of the harsher aspects of ancient Stoicism, like its seeming indifference to suffering, and presented it as a practical guide to living a virtuous, resilient life in troubled times. This new synthesis, Neostoicism, became incredibly popular among soldiers, statesmen, and scholars across Europe. The influence of Neostoicism can be seen everywhere in the culture of the era. It shaped the ideal of the Renaissance gentleman: rational, self-possessed, courageous in the face of adversity, and dedicated to public duty. You can see it in the literature of the time. Shakespeare's characters often wrestle with Stoic dilemmas. Think of Hamlet's famous line, "To be or not to be." He's grappling with the Stoic problem of how to act virtuously in a world full of corruption and suffering. When Horatio describes Hamlet as a man who is not a pipe for fortune's finger to sound, "What stops ye, please?" he is paying him the ultimate Neo-Stoic compliment, praising his emotional self. In art, Neo-Stoicism influenced portraiture. Artists like Rembrandt and Rubens painted portraits that went beyond surface appearance to capture the inner character and moral strength of the subject. A portrait of a general wasn't just about his uniform and medals. It was about conveying his constancy, his fortitude, his leadership, all key Neo-Stoic virtues. So, if we put it all together, what do we have? We have two powerful philosophical currents flowing through the Renaissance, each shaping culture in its own unique way. Neoplatonism, with its focus on divine beauty and the soul's ascent, was idealistic, mystical, and aspirational. It fueled the artistic imagination, pushing artists to create works that elevated the human spirit and pointed towards a higher reality. It was the philosophy of beauty, love, and divine inspiration. On the other hand, Neostoicism was practical, ethical, and grounded. It provided a code of conduct for navigating a dangerous and unpredictable world. It was the philosophy of duty, reason, and inner strength. It shaped the character of leaders, soldiers, and citizens, emphasizing resilience and public service. These two philosophies weren't necessarily in conflict. In many ways, they complemented each other. A Renaissance individual could be inspired by Neoplatonic ideals of beauty and truth, while practicing Neo-Stoic virtues of self-control and constancy in their daily life. Together, they helped create the unique intellectual climate of the Renaissance age that looked back to the wisdom of the ancients, not to copy it, but to build upon it, forging a new dynamic and profoundly human-centered vision of the world. It's a powerful reminder that ideas, even ancient ones, have the power to change everything. Ever wondered where you fit in the grand scheme of things? Are we just animals with bigger brains? Or are we something more, something closer to the divine? This wasn't just a late-night thought for people in the Renaissance. It was one of the biggest questions of their time. For centuries, the medieval view was pretty clear. God was at the top, followed by angels, then humans, animals, plants, and finally rocks at the very bottom. This was the great chain of being. Humans had their place and it was fixed. But then, starting in the 14th century, something incredible began to happen in Europe. People started looking back at the ancient Greeks and Romans, not just for their epic stories, but for their ideas about humanity. This was the birth of the Renaissance, a rebirth of art, science, and most importantly, a new way of thinking about ourselves. The Renaissance didn't throw out the idea of God or heaven. Instead, it placed humanity in a fascinating new position. Right in the middle, a unique link between the physical world of earth and the spiritual realm of heaven. Think of it like a cosmic bridge. We have a physical body, we get hungry, we sleep, we are part of the material world, just like animals and plants. But we also have something they don't, a soul, a mind capable of reason, creativity, and a yearning for something greater. This dual nature is what makes us special. We are part of the earth, but we have the potential to reach for the heavens. This idea, known as humanism, completely changed the game. It wasn't about rejecting faith. It was about celebrating the incredible potential God had given to humanity. One of the most powerful expressions of this idea comes from a philosopher named Giovanni Pico della Mirandola. In his famous oration on the dignity of man, he imagines God speaking to Adam, the first human. God says something amazing. He tells Adam that, unlike angels or animals who have a fixed nature, humans have no limits. We are free to choose what we become. We can choose to live a base, animalistic life, sinking down to the level of beasts. Or we can use our intellect and spirit to ascend, to become like the angels, even like God himself. Imagine hearing that. It's an incredible declaration of freedom and potential. You are not defined by your birth or your station. You are the maker and molder of thyself. This was a revolutionary concept that put human choice and dignity front and center. You can see this explosion of human potential everywhere in Renaissance art. Look at Michelangelo's David. It's not just a statue of a biblical hero. It's a perfect, powerful human form, confident and intelligent. David's gaze is thoughtful. His body is strong. He's not just a servant of God. He's a magnificent creation in his own right, embodying that potential Pico talked about. Or think about Leonardo da Vinci, Vitruvian Man. That famous drawing of a man inside a circle and a square isn't just about perfect proportions. It symbolizes how humanity is the measure of all things, perfectly fitting within both the earthly, geometric square and the divine, infinite circle. We are the center, the connection point for the entire universe. The art of the Renaissance is a visual celebration of this newfound human dignity. This shift in thinking wasn't just for artists and philosophers. It sparked a revolution in science and exploration. If humans had this incredible capacity for a reason, why not use it to understand the world? This led people like Copernicus to look at the stars and question the old model of the universe. He proposed that the Earth wasn't the center. The sun was. This was a huge deal, not just for astronomy, but for our place in the cosmos. It was a direct result of that humanist confidence in our ability to observe, reason, and figure things out for ourselves. Similarly, explorers, like Columbus and Magellan, set sail into unknown oceans. They were driven by a belief in human capability, a desire to push the boundaries of the known world and see what lay beyond the horizon. The Renaissance was an age of looking both inward at the human soul and outward at the physical world. Of course, this new freedom came with a new responsibility. If you're free to choose your own path, you're also responsible for the choices you make. This created a kind of tension. How do you balance your earthly desires with your spiritual aspirations? How do you live a good, meaningful life in this world while still keeping an eye on the next? This is a theme you see in the literature of the time, like in Shakespeare's plays. His characters, like Hamlet, are complex, torn, and deeply human. They grappled questions of morality, purpose, and their own flawed nature. They are not simple medieval archetypes of good and evil. They are individuals struggling with the weight of their own freedom, trying to navigate their position between the mud and the stars. This tension is also beautifully captured in the architecture of the period. Think of the great domes built during the Renaissance, like Brunelleschi's dome on the Florence Cathedral. When you stand beneath it, your eyes are drawn upward, toward the heavens, toward the divine light streaming in. It's an architectural representation of that human aspiration to ascend. But at the same time, the building is firmly planted on the ground. It's a human creation, a testament to human ingenuity, mathematics, and engineering. The entire structure is a metaphor for the Renaissance human, feet on the earth, eyes on the heavens, a magnificent creation that bridges both worlds. So, this idea of humanity as the link between earth and heaven wasn't just an abstract philosophical concept. It was the engine of the Renaissance. It fueled the art that still moves us, the science that shaped our modern world, and the spirit of exploration that redrew the maps. It gave people a profound sense of purpose and dignity. It told them that their lives on earth mattered, that their minds were a gift, and that their potential was limitless. It was a powerful and optimistic view of what it means to be human. And in a way, this Renaissance question is still with us today. We live in a world of incredible technology and scientific knowledge. We've mapped the human genome, We've sent rovers to Mars, and we carry the sum of human knowledge in our pockets. We've certainly embraced the Renaissance ideal of using our intellect to understand and shape the material world. But what about the other side of the bridge? What about our connection to something more? To meaning, to purpose, to the spiritual side of our nature in our busy, data-driven lives? It's easy to forget that we are not just our bodies or our brains. We are creatures who crave beauty, who ask why, and who look up at the stars and wonder about our place in it all. The Renaissance reminds us that we are at our best when we embrace our full nature, our earthly physical selves, and our transcendent spiritual selves. It teaches us that celebrating human potential doesn't mean abandoning faith or a sense of wonder. It means recognizing that we are uniquely positioned to experience both the richness of the world around us and the call of something higher. So, the next time you look at a piece of Renaissance art or hear a story about a great explorer from that era, remember the powerful idea that drove them, that you, as a human being, are a bridge between earth and heaven, with the freedom to choose your path and the potential to achieve greatness. Ever wondered how we went from a world dominated by dogma to one that celebrates human genius? The answer lies in one of the most explosive periods in history, the Renaissance. This wasn't just about pretty paintings and fancy buildings. It was a battle for the human mind, a dramatic clash between the burgeoning freedom of thought and the centuries-old authority of the Church. Imagine Europe in the late Middle Ages. Life was tough, and the Church was the ultimate authority on everything, from science and philosophy to your very soul. Its doctrines were law, and questioning them was not just discouraged, it was dangerous. But then something began to stir. Scholars started unearthing forgotten texts from ancient Greece and Rome, not just religious scriptures, but works of philosophy, science, and literature. They read Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, and a radical idea began to take hold. Humanism. Humanism wasn't about rejecting God. Far from it. Many of the greatest Renaissance thinkers were devout Christians. Instead, it was about celebrating human potential. It was the belief that humans, created in God's image, had the capacity for reason, creativity, and greatness right here on earth. This was a revolutionary shift. For centuries, the focus had been on the afterlife, on enduring this life to get to the next. Now, people started to see the value in this life, in human achievement, and in understanding the world through observation and reason, not just faith. This new spirit lit a fire across Europe. In Florence, the Medici family, powerful bankers with a passion for art, funded geniuses like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. These weren't just artists, they were polymaths. Leonardo studied anatomy by dissecting human bodies, a practice once heavily frowned upon to understand how we move. His notebooks are filled with incredible inventions and scientific observations. Michelangelo's David isn't just a statue, it's the perfect embodiment of human potential and beauty. A far cry from the stylized, two-dimensional figures of medieval art. Art became a celebration of humanity itself. But this new way of thinking inevitably collided with the established order. The Church had its own view of the cosmos, one with the earth at the center, divinely ordained. Then came Nicolaus Copernicus, a Polish astronomer and cleric. After decades of observation, he proposed a shocking theory. The earth was not the center of the universe. The sun was. His work, published right before his death, was revolutionary. It demoted humanity from the center of God's creation to just another planet orbiting a star. The Church didn't react immediately, but the seeds of conflict were sown. A few decades later, An Italian astronomer named Galileo Galilei built a powerful telescope and saw the proof with his own eyes. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proving not everything revolved around the Earth. He saw the phases of Venus, just like our moon, which only made sense if Venus orbited the Sun. Galileo, a confident and sometimes abrasive man, enthusiastically promoted the Copernican system. This was a direct challenge to the Church's authority and its interpretation of Scripture. The Holy Inquisition was not amused. In 1633, Galileo was put on trial for heresy. Facing the threat of torture, the elderly astronomer was forced to publicly recant his finding. He was placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. Legend has it that as he rose from his knees after his recantation, he muttered, "And yet it moves," referring to the earth. Whether he said it or not, the sentiment was clear. You can silence a man, but you can't silence the truth. The printing press, an invention from the mid-15th century, was the internet of its day. It allowed these new, challenging ideas to spread like wildfire. Martin Luther, a German monk, famously challenged the Church's practices, like the selling of indulgences, which were essentially get-out, purgatory-free cards. He argued that salvation came through faith alone, not through rituals or payments to the Church. His 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in 1517, were quickly printed and distributed across Europe, igniting the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation shattered the religious unity of Europe. It was a direct consequence of this new Renaissance spirit of questioning authority and returning to original sources, in this case, the Bible itself. People began reading the Bible in their own languages for the first time, interpreting it for themselves rather than relying solely on the clergy. This was a profound act of intellectual independence. The clash wasn't just in the heavens or in theology. It was also in politics. Thinkers like Niccolo Machiavelli, in his infamous book, The Prince, separated politics from traditional morality and religion. He argued that a ruler should do whatever is necessary to maintain power, even if it's considered cruel or immoral. This was a pragmatic, human-centered view of politics, a stark departure from the medieval idea of the divinely appointed king who ruled with Christian virtue. Machiavelli was looking at the world as it was, not as it ought to be. So the Renaissance was far more than a cultural rebirth. It was a messy, complicated, and often dangerous struggle. It was a period where brave individuals, armed with reason, observation, and a newfound belief in human capability, dared to question centuries of dogma. They studied the human body, charted the stars, reformed religion, and reimagined politics. The Church didn't simply roll over. It responded with the Counter-Reformation, a period of internal reform, but also a crackdown on heresy through the Inquisition. The conflict led to devastating religious wars that tore Europe apart for over a century. It was a painful transition, but the genie could not be put back in the bottle. The legacy of the Renaissance is the world we live in today. The value we placed on critical thinking, scientific inquiry, individual freedom, and artistic expression all have their roots in this incredible period. It was the moment humanity rediscovered its own power to think, to create, and to challenge, setting the stage for the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the modern age. The struggle between freedom of thought and established authority didn't end in the 17th century. It's a tension that continues to shape our world. Have you ever looked at a breathtaking sunset, a stunning piece of art, or even a beautiful face, and wondered, what is it that makes this beautiful? Is it just in the eye of the beholder, or is there something more to it? we're going to travel back in time to the Renaissance, a period from the 14th to the 17th century, to explore a truly fascinating idea that beauty isn't just skin deep, but a divine window into the very nature of God now. When we think of the Renaissance, names like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael immediately come to mind. We picture magnificent paintings, soaring cathedrals, and sculptures that seem to breathe. But these weren't just artistic achievements. They were expressions of a profound philosophical shift. The thinkers and artists of this era were obsessed with beauty, but not in the way we might think of it today, like a fleeting trend or a superficial quality. For them, beauty was an objective, universal truth. It was a reflection of divine perfection. This idea has its roots in ancient Greece, particularly with the philosopher Plato. Plato believed that the physical world we see is just a shadow of a higher, more perfect reality, the world of forms. In this higher realm, there exists the perfect form of beauty itself. So, a beautiful flower or a beautiful person is beautiful because it participates in or copies this ultimate perfect form of beauty. It's like they have a little piece of the perfect idea of beauty within them. Renaissance thinkers who were rediscovering and celebrating classical philosophy took Plato's ideas and merged them with Christian theology. This fusion is often called Neo. A key figure in this movement was Marsilio Ficino, an Italian scholar and philosopher working for the powerful Medici family in Florence. Ficino argued that since God is the source of all perfection, God must also be the source of all beauty. Therefore, when we experience beauty in the world, we are actually experiencing a glimpse of God's own divine nature. Think about it this way. For Ficino and his contemporaries, beauty was a ladder. The first rung of the ladder is the physical beauty we see with our eyes, the beauty of a human body, a landscape, or a work of art. But this physical beauty isn't the final destination. Its purpose is to awaken a love and yearning in our souls. This love then lifts our minds upward from appreciating the beauty of a single object to appreciating the harmony and order of the entire universe. And from there, it leads us ultimately to the source of all beauty and all order, God. So, for a Renaissance artist, creating a beautiful painting was not just about making something pretty. It was a spiritual act. It was an attempt to capture and represent the divine harmony that underpins all of creation. This is why you see such an emphasis on proportion, symmetry, and harmony in Renaissance art. They weren't just following artistic rules. They believed these principia mathematical ratios and perfect geometric forms were the very language God used to create the universe. They were literally trying to paint the mind of God. Let's look at Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, for example. It's more than just a drawing of a man in a circle and a square. It's a philosophical statement. It represents the idea that the human body, created in God's image, contains the perfect proportions of the universe. The microcosm of man reflects the macrocosm of the cosmos. The beauty of the human form was seen as the pinnacle of earthly beauty, a direct link to the divine creator. This belief also explains the incredible care and detail that went into a building like Brunelleschi's Dome in Florence or St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The architects used precise mathematical principles to create spaces that were not just impressive, but were designed to evoke a sense of awe and transcendence. When you walk into one of these cathedrals, the soaring heights, the perfect arches, and the way light streams through the windows are all meant to lift your spirit, to make you feel a connection to something larger than yourself, to the divine. The beauty of the building was a pathway to God. This philosophy wasn't just confined to art and architecture. It permeated Renaissance, thought on love, music, and even science. The concept of platonic love, which we now use to describe a non-romantic friendship, originally had a much deeper meaning for thinkers like Fassin. It was the love of another person's soul, recognizing the divine beauty within them, which would ultimately lead you closer to loving God. Music, too, was understood in these terms. The harmony of musical chords was believed to echo the music of the spheres, a divine, unheard harmony created by the perfect mathematical movement of the planets and stars. Composing a beautiful piece of music was another way of channeling the divine order of the cosmos. But what does this all mean for us today? We live in a very different world. Our modern view of beauty is often subjective, commercialized, and we're told beauty is in the eye of the beholder. But the Renaissance perspective offers us a powerful alternative. What if we tried to see the world through their eyes, just for a moment? What if the next time you see something beautiful, you paused and considered it not just as a pleasant sensation, but as a small echo of a greater universal harmony? What if you saw it as a signpost pointing towards something transcendent? This doesn't mean you have to adopt a 15th century theology. It's more about shifting our perception. It's about re-enchanting the world a little bit. Instead of just scrolling past a beautiful image, we could take a moment to truly appreciate the balance, the color, the form. When we listen to a moving piece of music, we could listen for the harmony that resonates deep within us. The Renaissance thinkers believe that our souls inherently recognize and are drawn to this divine harmony because our souls originated from it. That's why beauty feels so good. It's a homecoming for the soul. This idea invites us to look for beauty everywhere, not just in art galleries, but in the intricate patterns of a leaf, the mathematical perfection of a snowflake, the kindness in a person's actions, or the elegant logic of a scientific equation. All of these, from a Renaissance viewpoint, could be seen as reflections of a single, unifying, divine source. So, the next time you find yourself captivated by beauty, remember the Renaissance philosophers. Remember Fassino's ladder. Perhaps that feeling of awe and wonder is more than just a fleeting emotion. Perhaps it's your soul recognizing a fragment of its divine origin, a small piece of the infinite beauty that structures our universe. It's a profound and, well, beautiful thought, isn't it? It transforms beauty from a mere object of admiration into an active spiritual experience. Have you ever heard someone described as it's usually not a compliment, right? It conjures up images of a cunning, ruthless person who will do anything to get what they want. But is that really what Niccolo Machiavelli was all about? We're going to dive deep into the world of Renaissance Florence and uncover the real story behind one of history's most misunderstood thinkers. We'll explore how he completely ripped up the rulebook on politics and morality, creating a new, secular ethics that still echoes in the halls of power today. The Renaissance, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, was a mind-blowing period of rebirth. It was a time when Europe was shaking off the dust of the Middle Ages and rediscovering the art, science, and philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome. This wasn't just about painting beautiful pictures or building grand cathedrals. It was a fundamental shift in how people saw the world and their place in it. The focus moved from a purely divine, God-centered universe to a more human-centered one, a concept we call humanism. Thinkers and artists started celebrating human potential, intellect, and creativity. Right in the heart of this cultural explosion was Florence, Italy. And in Florence, there was a man named Niccolo Machiavelli. Born in 1469, he wasn't a king or a pope. He was a civil servant, a diplomat, and a political theorist. He lived and breathed the chaotic, cutthroat world of Italian city-state politics. He saw firsthand how rulers rose and fell, how alliances were made and broken in the blink of an eye, and how power was the ultimate currency. His most famous work, The Prince, wasn't written in an ivory tower. It was a practical guide, a job application of sorts, written after he lost his political post, hoping to win favor with the new ruling Medici family. So, what made Machiavelli so revolutionary? It was his daring separation of politics from traditional Christian morality. Before him, the ideal ruler was supposed to be a model Christian, pious, merciful, honest, and just. The thinking was that a good ruler must first be a good man. Guided by divine law, kings were seen as God's representatives on earth, and their actions were judged by heavenly standards. This was the world of what we call specula principum, or mirrors for princes' books that told rulers how to be. Machiavelli looked at this and basically said, "That's nice, but it doesn't work." He saw that the rulers who strictly followed these Christian virtues often ended up losing their states and their lives. In the real world, being merciful could be seen as weakness, and being honest could get you tricked. He argued that a ruler's primary duty wasn't to save his own soul, but to protect and maintain the state. This is the core of his secular ethics. The survival and stability of the state became the highest good, the ultimate moral goal. This is where things get juicy. Machiavelli introduces the idea of virtù. Now, this isn't the same as our modern word virtue, which means moral goodness. For Machiavelli, virtù was a mix of skill, courage, ambition, and the ability to adapt to circumstances. It's the quality that allows a leader to navigate the unpredictable winds of fortuna or fortune. Fortuna, in his view, was like a raging river or a fickle woman, wild, unpredictable, and powerful. A leader with virtù could build dams and levees to control the river of fortune, or at least channel it to his advantage. He couldn't always control what happened, but he could control how he responded. So how does a prince with virtù act? Well, Machiavelli famously argued that it's better to be feared than loved if you can't be both. Why? Because love is fickle. People love you when things are good, but their loyalty can vanish when times get tough. Fear, on the other hand, is a more reliable motivator. It's maintained by the threat of punishment, which is always in the prince's control. But he's very clear on this point. A prince should avoid being hated. Fear is one thing, hatred is another. Hatred inspires conspiracies and rebellion. So, a prince can be feared, but he must never touch his subjects' property or the honor of their women. That's the line that turns fear into dangerous hatred. He also had some shocking things to say about honesty. A wise ruler, he wrote, cannot and should not keep his word when it puts him at a disadvantage. Since men are generally not good and will break their promises to you, you don't have to keep your promises to them. The prince needs to be a master of deception. He should appear to be merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and upright, but be ready to act in the opposite way when necessary. He compared the ideal ruler to a combination of a lion and a fox. The lion can protect himself from traps, and the fox can defend himself from wolves. So, you need to be a fox to recognize the traps and a lion to frighten the wolves. You need both strength and cunning. This is the concept of the ends justify the means. While Machiavelli never actually wrote that exact phrase, it perfectly captures his philosophy. The end is the security and prosperity of the state. The means are the actions a ruler takes to achieve that end, even if those actions, like lying, breaking treaties, or using violence, are considered immoral in a personal or religious context. For Machiavelli, there was a public morality for rulers and a private morality for citizens. A private citizen who lies and cheats is just a bad person. A ruler who does so to save the state is, in Machiavelli's view, doing their job. The success of the state is the ultimate justification. Let's be clear. Machiavelli wasn't a monster who loved cruelty for its own sake. He distinguished between cruelty used well and cruelty used badly. Cruelty used well is decisive, swift, and applied once to secure power, and then it's stopped. It's a necessary evil to prevent greater chaos and bloodshed later. Cruelty used badly is when it grows over time, is applied inconsistently, and creates constant fear and hatred, ultimately destabilizing the state. So even his advice on violence was pragmatic, not sadistic. It was all about efficiency and achieving the long-term goal of a stable society. The impact of this was enormous. By separating the political sphere from the religious one, Machiavelli laid the groundwork for modern political science. He was one of the first to analyze politics as it actually is, not as it ought to be. He looked at history and the world around him and drew cold, hard conclusions based on observation. This empirical, realistic approach was a radical departure from the ideal-driven political philosophy that came before him. Of course, his ideas were incredibly controversial. The prince was placed on the Catholic Church's index of forbidden books, and his name became synonymous with evil. But was he evil, or was he just a realist? A patriot who had seen his beloved Italy torn apart by weak, indecisive leaders and foreign invaders. He believed that to create a good society, a ruler sometimes had to get his hands dirty. Perhaps he wasn't teaching evil, but simply exposing the uncomfortable truths about power that many people in charge already knew but were afraid to say out loud. In the end, Machiavelli's secular ethics force us to ask some very difficult questions that are still relevant today. What is the relationship between morality and power? Can a leader be both a good person and an effective ruler? And when the security of a nation is at stake, do the ends truly justify the means? Machiavelli didn't provide easy answers, but by daring to ask the questions, he changed the way we think about politics forever. He peeled back the layers of religious and moral dogma to reveal the raw, often brutal mechanics of how power works. Love him or hate him, you can't ignore him. When we think of the Renaissance, what comes to mind? Masterpieces of art, groundbreaking scientific discoveries, a flourishing of human potential, right? It's often called the Age of Rebirth, a time when humanity seemed to shake off the dust of the Middle Ages and stride confidently into a new era of knowledge and certainty. But what if I told you that beneath this glittering surface of confidence, a powerful undercurrent of doubt was brewing? What if the late Renaissance wasn't just about finding answers, but about questioning whether we could ever truly know anything at all? We're diving deep into the fascinating and often overlooked world of Renaissance skepticism, a philosophical movement that would shake the very foundations of Western thought and set the stage for the modern world. To understand this crisis of certainty, we need to look at the perfect storm of events that defined the 5th and 16th centuries. First, the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, he didn't just split Christianity. He shattered the single, unified source of truth that had dominated European life for 1,000 years. Suddenly, there were competing claims to divine truth. If the Church could be wrong about salvation, what else could it be wrong about? This religious turmoil created a deep sense of instability. People were forced to ask themselves, who do I believe? How can I know which version of the truth is the right one? The old certainties were crumbling, and nothing seemed solid anymore. At the same time, explorers like Columbus and Magellan were literally redrawing the map of the world. They discovered new continents, new cultures, and new peoples with entirely different beliefs and customs. Europeans were confronted with the shocking realization that their way of life, their religion, and their morality were not the only ones. Think about it. For centuries, they believed they lived at the center of the world with a clear understanding of humanity. Now, they were faced with societies that functioned perfectly well with completely different rules. This exposure to radical diversity led to a kind of cultural relativism. If so many different ways of life existed, how could anyone claim their own was the one true, correct way? It planted a seed of doubt about the universality of their own values. And then there was the rediscovery of ancient texts. Humanist scholars were unearthing and translating long-lost works from classical Greece and Rome. While this fueled much of the Renaissance's creative energy, it also brought back the forgotten arguments of the ancient skeptics, particularly a philosopher named Sextus. His writings were a bombshell. He laid out the arguments of a school of thought called Pyrrhonism, which didn't just question a few beliefs, but questioned the very possibility of knowledge itself. The Pyrrhonists argued that for any claim you make, an equally strong counter-argument could be made. Faced with these opposing claims, the only rational response was to suspend judgment, to stop claiming you know anything for certain. Imagine the impact of this idea on a world already reeling from religious and cultural shocks. The tools of classical logic and reason, which the Renaissance so admired, were now being used to dismantle the very idea of certainty. This intellectual crisis found its most eloquent and personal voice in a French nobleman named Michel de Montaigne. After retiring from public life, Montaigne created a new form of writing, the essay. His essays were not grand, systematic treatises. They were personal, meandering explorations of his own thoughts, doubts, and experiences. And his central question was, Q says G, what do I know? Montaigne looked at the chaos of the religious wars raging in France. He read the accounts of newly discovered cultures, and he studied the ancient skeptics. His conclusion was one of profound intellectual humility. He saw human reason as a weak, vain, and fickle tool. He pointed out how our senses deceive us, how our judgments are swayed by our emotions, and how even the most brilliant minds constantly contradict each other. He famously wrote about how customs we consider normal are seen as bizarre elsewhere, and vice versa. For Montaigne, the constant strife and disagreement in the world was proof that humans simply were unequipped to arrive at absolute truth. His solution wasn't despair, but a kind of gentle, self-aware acceptance of our own limits. He advocated for tolerance, moderation, and looking inward to understand oneself rather than trying to impose one's beliefs on others. Montaigne's essays were incredibly popular, and they brought the complex ideas of skepticism out of the dusty libraries and into the hands of the educated public. The impact of this wave of skepticism was enormous. It created a deep intellectual anxiety. If we can't trust our senses, our reason, or even divine revelation, what's left? This problem became the central challenge for the next generation of thinkers. In fact, you could say that the entire course of 17th century philosophy was a direct response to the doubts raised by Montaigne and the rediscovery of ancient skepticism. Think of René Descartes, sitting by his stove, resolving to doubt everything: his senses, his memories, even the existence of the physical world. Why did he do this? He was trying to find one single, undeniable truth that could withstand the most radical, skeptical attacks. His famous conclusion, "I think, therefore I am," was his attempt to build a new foundation for knowledge on the bedrock of certainty, a foundation that the skeptics couldn't wash away. Descartes wasn't a skeptic himself, but his entire philosophical project was motivated by the need to defeat skepticism. Other thinkers took different paths. Francis Bacon, for example, saw the problem not in reason itself, but in the old, flawed ways of using it. He argued that the old scholastic methods were useless for discovering new things about the world. His solution was to develop a new scientific method, one based on careful observation, experimentation, and inductive reasoning, by gathering data from the world and building knowledge from the ground up. Bacon believed we could overcome the limitations of pure reason and achieve a more reliable, practical kind of knowledge. His work laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution, which was, in its own way, another answer to the crisis of certainty. It proposed that through rigorous empirical methods, we could gain a true and useful understanding of the natural world, even if absolute metaphysical truth remained out of reach. So, the next time you picture the Renaissance, remember it wasn't just a golden age of confidence. It was also an age of profound anxiety and doubt. The breakdown of religious unity, the discovery of new worlds, and the revival of ancient skepticism created a crisis that forced thinkers to question everything. This crisis of doubt wasn't a dead end, though it was a crucible. It forced a radical rethinking of what it means to know something. It cleared the way for new philosophical systems like Descartes' rationalism and new scientific methods like Bacon's. In a way, the modern world, with its emphasis on scientific inquiry, individual reason, and tolerance for different beliefs, was forged in the fires of late Renaissance doubt. The question, "What do I know?" posed by Montaigne didn't lead to nihilism, but to a more humble, more critical, and ultimately more productive search for answers that continues to this day. Have you ever wondered what really sparked the Renaissance? We often hear this story of Europe suddenly waking up from the Dark Ages, rediscovering ancient Greek and Roman texts, and boom art, science, and philosophy flourish. But what if I told you that story is missing a huge, crucial chapter? What if the light of the Renaissance wasn't just reignited from ancient embers, but was carefully carried and amplified by another great civilization? We're uncovering the hidden stories of how Arab and Islamic philosophy laid the groundwork for one of the most transformative periods in human history. Let's rewind a bit. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, much of Europe entered a period where access to classical knowledge was scarce. Many of the great works of Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, and Galen were lost to the Latin-speaking world, but they weren't lost to history. While Europe was in its so-called Dark Ages, the Islamic world was experiencing its golden age. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba became bustling centers of learning and intellectual curiosity. This wasn't just about preserving old texts. Scholars in the Islamic world embarked on a massive translation movement. They meticulously translated Greek, Persian, and Indian works into Arabic. But here's the key part. They didn't just copy them. They studied them, debated them, criticized them, and built upon them. This created a vibrant intellectual ecosystem where philosophy and science thrived. Thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and the great Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, weren't just commentators. They were groundbreaking philosophers in their own right. Ibn Sina, for example, wrote the Canon of Medicine, a monumental medical encyclopedia that synthesized Greek and Islamic medical knowledge. This book became the standard medical textbook in European universities for centuries, well into the Renaissance. He also developed his own complex philosophical system, blending Aristotelian thought with new ideas about the soul, metaphysics, and logic. He grappled with questions about existence, God, and the human intellect in ways that would profoundly shape later European thought. Then there's Ibn Rushd, or Avros, as he was known in Europe, living in ER century Cordoba, in what is now Spain. Ibn Rushd was perhaps the most influential commentator on Aristotle the world had ever seen. His detailed analyses were so insightful that he became known simply as the commentator. He argued passionately for the harmony of philosophy and religion, asserting that rational inquiry was a valid path to truth. He believed that the literal text of Scripture could be interpreted metaphorically if it appeared to contradict reason. This was a radical idea, and it got him into a lot of trouble. But his writings would ignite a fire in Europe. So how did all this knowledge get to Europe? The transfer happened through several key points of contact. One of the most important was Spain, or Al-Andalus. For centuries, Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived and worked together there, creating a rich cultural and intellectual melting pot. Cities like Toledo became major centers for translation. But this time, the flow was in the other direction. Scholars flocked to Spain to translate the great works of Arabic philosophy and science into Latin. Imagine a scholar in 12th century Paris who has only heard whispers of the great Aristotle. Suddenly, through these translations from Arabic, he has access not only to Aristotle's original works, but also to centuries of brilliant commentary and expansion by thinkers like Ibn Rushd. It was like discovering a whole new intellectual universe. This influx of knowledge carried through Arabic was a massive shock to the European system. It challenged existing dogma and sparked intense debate in the newly forming universities. The ideas of Ibn Rushd in particular were his emphasis on reason and logic gave rise to a movement known as Latin Averroes. These thinkers pushed the boundaries of what was considered acceptable philosophical inquiry. While the church often pushed back against these radical ideas, they couldn't stop them from spreading. These debates forced European scholars to sharpen their own arguments and engage with logic and natural philosophy in a much more rigorous way. This was the intellectual fertilizer that helped the soil of Europe become ready for the Renaissance. It wasn't just philosophy. Think about science and mathematics. The very numbers we use today are called Arabic numerals. The concept of zero, which came from India, was popularized and spread by Arab mathematicians. Algebra. The name itself comes from the title of a book by the 9th century mathematician Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Jabr. His work introduced systematic methods for solving linear and quadratic equations. Without algebra and the decimal point system, the complex calculations needed for Renaissance engineering, architecture, and astronomy would have been nearly impossible. Think of astronomers like Copernicus, who proposed that the Earth revolves around the Sun. His work didn't happen in a vacuum. He drew upon astronomical models and observations made by Islamic astronomers from centuries earlier, like those from the Maraga Observatory in Persia. These astronomers had already identified mathematical problems with the old Ptolemaic model of the universe and proposed non-Ptolemaic models that were mathematically equivalent to some of Copernicus's own. They laid the mathematical and observational groundwork that later European astronomers would build upon. Even Renaissance art was touched by this cross-cultural exchange. Techniques in optics developed by scholars like Ibn al-Hahama, known as influenced Renaissance artists' understanding of perspective and light. His Book of Optics was a revolutionary work that described how vision occurs, and it was widely studied in Europe. The quest for realism that defined Renaissance art owed a debt to the scientific understanding of vision that was passed down through these Arabic texts. So, when we look at the masterpieces of Leonardo da Vinci or read the philosophies of the humanists, we need to expand our view. The Renaissance wasn't a miracle that sprang out of nowhere. It was the culmination of a long, complex process of knowledge transmission. It was a global conversation that had been happening for centuries. The Islamic world acted as a crucial bridge, not just preserving ancient knowledge, but enriching it, challenging it, and passing on a far more advanced intellectual toolkit to Europe. Recognizing this doesn't diminish the achievements of the Renaissance. Not at all. It makes the story richer, more complex, and more accurate. It shows us that history is not a series of isolated events, but a web of interconnected stories where civilizations learn from, challenge, and inspire one another. The light of knowledge is not owned by any one culture. It's a torch passed from hand to hand across generations and across borders. The European Renaissance was a brilliant flame, but it was lit from a torch that had been burning brightly in the Arab and Islamic world for centuries. We're diving deep into one of the most transformative periods in human history, the Renaissance. We often think of it as a time of breathtaking art and groundbreaking inventions, but it was so much more. It was a period that fundamentally changed how we understand the very concept of truth itself. Before the Renaissance, for nearly 1,000 years during the Middle Ages, the idea of truth was largely monolithic. It was seen as something revealed, handed down from a higher authority. The Church was the ultimate arbiter of truth, and its doctrines, along with ancient texts from figures like Aristotle, provided the framework for understanding the world. Truth was something you received, not something you discovered. To question it was not just a scholarly error, it was a moral one. This system provided stability and a shared sense of reality for centuries. But as the 14th century dawned, the seeds of a profound shift were already being sown. So, what changed? Several factors converged to create a perfect storm of intellectual revolution. The Black Death, a devastating plague, shook people's faith in established institutions. How could this happen if everything was divinely ordered? Increased trade and the rediscovery of long-lost classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, brought back by scholars fleeing the fall of Constantinople, opened up new and sometimes conflicting perspectives. Suddenly, the single, unified source of truth was fracturing. People started to realize that the ancient world was not a monolith, and that respected thinkers like Plato and Aristotle often disagreed with each other. This created a space for doubt, for questioning, and for a new kind of intellectual curiosity. This is where humanism enters the picture. Humanism wasn't an anti-religious movement. In fact, many of its greatest thinkers were devoutly religious, but it placed a new emphasis on human potential, human reason, and human experience. Humanists believed that humans were created in God's image and were thus capable of incredible things, including understanding the world for themselves. The new motto was E di fontes, which means back to the sources. Instead of relying on centuries of commentary and interpretation, Scholars insisted on going back to the original Greek and Latin texts to read them with fresh eyes. This simple act was revolutionary. It was a declaration that truth could be found through direct engagement and critical analysis, not just through passive acceptance of tradition. This shift had a ripple effect across every field of human endeavor. Let's start with art. Medieval art was primarily symbolic. A painting of a saint wasn't meant to be a realistic portrait. It was meant to convey a religious truth. The figures were often flat, their importance shown by their size, not their position in space. But Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo saw things differently. They became obsessed with observing the real world. They studied human anatomy, dissecting bodies to understand how muscles and bones worked. They developed mathematical principles like linear perspective to create a convincing illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. For them, a painting was a window onto the world. The truth of a painting was no longer just its religious message, but its faithfulness to reality, its anatomical correctness, its accurate depiction of light and shadow. They were using their own eyes, their own observations, to capture a new kind of truth, empirical truth. And this leads us directly to the scientific revolution, which was born out of this same Renaissance mindset. Think of Nicolaus Copernicus. For over a millennium, the geocentric model of the universe, with the Earth at the center, was accepted as absolute truth, supported by both the Church and ancient science. But Copernicus, through meticulous mathematical observation, proposed a radical new idea. What if the sun was at the center? He wasn't just guessing. He was using observation and reason to challenge and establish truth. Then came Galileo. When the telescope was invented, Galileo didn't just accept what he was told it could do. He built his own, improved it, and pointed it at the heavens. What he saw shattered the old worldview. He saw mountains on the moon, proving it wasn't a perfect celestial sphere. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything orbited the Earth. When the authorities demanded he recant, they were defending a truth based on scripture and tradition. Galileo, on the other hand, was defending a truth based on direct, verifiable evidence. He famously, though perhaps apocryphally, muttered, "And yet it moves," referring to the Earth. This was the clash of two different definitions of truth, one based on authority, the other on observation. The truth was no longer just in a book. It was out there, waiting to be discovered through experimentation and observation. This revolution in thought wasn't confined to the elites. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 was the internet of its day. Suddenly, knowledge was no longer the exclusive property of monasteries and universities. Books, pamphlets, and new ideas could be mass-produced and disseminated across Europe at an unprecedented speed. The Bible itself, once available only in Latin and interpreted by the clergy, was translated into vernacular languages. For the first time, ordinary people could read the foundational texts of their faith and interpret them for themselves. This led directly to the Protestant Reformation, where figures like Martin Luther challenged the authority of the Church, arguing that an individual's personal faith and direct relationship with God, guided by Scripture, was the path to truth. The monopoly on truth was broken. Truth became more personal, more individual. So, what does this all mean? The Renaissance didn't discover the truth. Instead, it pluralized the very concept of it. It proposed that truth wasn't a single, static object to be guarded, but a dynamic process of discovery. It could be found in the mathematical harmony of a painting, in the stars observed through a telescope, in the careful reading of an ancient text and in the personal conscience of an individual. This shift from a revealed top-down truth to a discovered bottom-up truth is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Renaissance. It laid the foundation for the Enlightenment, the scientific method, and our modern conceptions of individualism and critical thinking. It taught us that our own senses, our own reason, and our own experiences are valid tools for understanding the world. It empowered humanity to question, to explore, and to create its own understanding of reality. The world we live in today, where we value scientific evidence, personal belief, and critical inquiry, is a direct heir to this incredible intellectual awakening. The next time you look at a piece of Renaissance art or read about a scientific discovery, remember that you're seeing more than just a painting or a theory. You're seeing the product of a revolution that redefined our relationship with truth itself. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what other historical topics you'd like to explore. And close your eyes and let the comforting fire sounds drift you into a tranquil dreamland.